873-2GB now presents a special tribute to John Pearce, one of the greats of Australian broadcasting.
Hello, Robertson here. I've never been crazy about moustaches, but I thought if Pearce can live with that one, I suppose I can. What a whopper. But really, he and the growth were essential to each other, huddling together like... I like John Pearce. He seemed to like me, like the conservative blokes that we communicated much like neighbours randomly throwing garbage over each other's fences. But what about what he did on air? Radio, as he would tell me, was for entertainment purposes only. That, of course, meant entertaining all the senses, the brain, the heart, the appendix, whatever. Journalists, we would agree, really aren't funny people. Mr. Pearce was not a journalist. Bit too bright for that. Bright, effervescent, bright, intelligent. Not one of those. He was one of the last of the old radio men. He never apologised for radio, but with a somewhat better picture. He was openly loyal to those on air at his station, and you knew he meant it. Like most ratbags, he didn't care much for management. Proof of that was that he never mentioned them on air, beneath his station, so to speak. But he did care for people. He was a bit like the biggest kitten in the litter, who would belt up the other kittens one moment, but be there when the fridge door opened to make sure they all had their fair share of food. Pearce really did like to annoy people on the air. The second half of his Saturday night show would tell us all what sort of mood Pearce was in tonight. We would wait, like the drawing of a lotto prize, to find out how the numbers would roll out for that night. Yes, he was rude, but strangely everyone who rang through thought they were special and would be afforded special treatment from the Oracle. Born optimists. I could see that JP would never retire. If you retire, you die, whether you die or not. He encouraged me unwittingly to resolve to never give up either. Of course, they say he was about 71. Nonsense. He was just a big, naughty boy with the enviable enthusiasm of a bright 10-year-old. If you saw that great face beam at some discovery, you'd realise that you were the older one, and it would pay you to listen. Look, I liked the guy. He was always there on Saturday nights. I would potter around with Pearce in the background trying to cure Australia's ills and send up the mentally challenged and joust with those who are out to get him. Pearce was a bit of a hero to a lot of little people, and now he's left us all. For something better, I trust. John Pearce always had the last word, but ironically not at the very end. We, at last now, have our chance to say what we feel about that lovely bloke. Hopefully without interruption.
Absolute rubbish.
School was not John's greatest love. He constantly had two things on his mind: flying and broadcasting. In fact, he was so obsessed with these pursuits that he ended his formal education at the tender age of 14 to follow his dreams.
He left school at 14. He always wanted to be a radio announcer from when he was very tiny, but he was sometimes unfortunate in a way that everything he wanted to do, he managed to do.
John's older sister, Dorothy Fisher. John's parents knew the value of an education, sending Dorothy and John to expensive Sydney private schools.
He went to Shore. First of all, he went to St John's, Darlinghurst, because I was at Skeggs and I used to go and pick him up after school and bring him home to Hurstville. We were both born in Cogra.
It's just my dream as a little kid to come up and broadcast on this station. I used to go home as a school kid and throw my homework in the corner and not do it, and turn on the radio and say, one day I will speak on that station. It took me a while to get here because the war came along, and then I did something in the country and then in Tasmania. But before I came up here in 54 and met up with just about the greatest radio team that's ever been assembled in the world, I would think. I was the junior boy. I was the young announcer late afternoons.
After leaving school, John briefly worked at several jobs: an office boy, a salesman, but all the time scanning the positions vacant columns of the papers for radio announcing jobs.
They advertised for a junior announcer at Kempsey when he was 14 and a half. And 60 people applied for the job and he got it. And he went up there and he used to run the children's session. And he had a little ukulele and he'd play and he'd have all the kids singing and so forth.
I'd found myself in Hobart when my ambitions for a career in radio hit the wall with a sacking from Radio 2UW in Sydney. Station 7HO offered me a job at £8.10 a week, and they put me up in a guest house where I was to share a converted garage with another guest. That other guest was a young radio pretender like myself, a few years older than I, since he had served in the RAAF, and was able to entertain us with stories of his exploits overseas. The young man was John Pearce, who told me he had two ambitions: to fly a plane and talk on the wireless by the time he was 18. And he achieved both. After D-Mob, John hit the country radio trail in pursuit of his dream, as most of us did. He'd come to 7HO via 2QN Deniliquin and 3SH Swan Hill. He probably read an ad in the Wireless and Broadcasting Weekly like most of us did, reading something like "Announcer required by capital city radio station. Applicants should be familiar with all facets of broadcasting. Salary £8.10 a week. Apply. Eric McRae, manager 7HO Hobart." 2GB program manager and John Pearce fan, Perce Campbell.
I first heard John Pearce on Tasmanian radio, and I didn't go to Tasmania. I was over there for another reason, but I happened to be listening to Tasmanian radio at the time I was there. Around the various stations, and I heard John Pearce, and he impressed me to be a man of great radio talent. And I thought I'd like to see the day that he came to 2GB back in Sydney.
Former 2GB manager Ted Harris recalls.
John became one of the most prominent broadcasting personalities, and he was an integral part of the 2GB team that dominated commercial broadcasting for a very long period of time.
One more question.
Go ahead.
How many calls, you're doing this program, collectively,
Yep.
about 25 years.
Yep.
I reckon you're close to about 150,000 calls.
I'd at least, yeah. But, when you're having fun, who's counting?
Sunday night, August 25th. And as usual, the Oracle is in great form on 2GB.
Yes, good evening, John. How are you?
I'm great, sir. Top of the world.
Well, I haven't rung you for about 20 years, actually. I didn't even know you were still around until I turned the dial.
Well, I'm not round. I'm more straight up and down these days. I used to be rounder.
Good evening, John.
Good evening, sir.
I believe you made a slight error earlier.
I don't make errors, sir.
Well, I really rang you up to see if you could give me some assistance and just give me a little bit of the oomph that keeps you going so good.
Well, I've already told you the answer to a workaholic is give them more work to do. Old people, when they get to about 65, they say, well, I'm a bit of an oldie, and I'm about 65, and they don't want to learn anything new. They don't want to learn anything new. They don't want to get into computers. Those people don't want to get on the internet. Few of them do. They're wonderful, wonderful. They say, no, there's nothing new I want to know. I've lived my life. I'm 65. Winston Churchill made his greatest speeches when he was 82. Tell me something you have learned, I challenge you, that you didn't know at this time last week.
But for a brief moment, the Oracle becomes a prophet. It might have been spoken in jest, but I wonder, did John know something we didn't? This was to be his last performance.
Now listen, how old, just a sec, I'm going to have a bit of a thing about this. How old are you?
70.
70.
Isn't that awful? And I didn't know.
And are you going to die?
No way.
Okay, now what was the question? Your grandson rang up to ask you, you poor old 70-year-old. I don't know that I'll see my way through to 8 o'clock tonight. I might die. I'm doing a commercial.
What for?
Money.
How do you mean money?
They pay me.
What sort of commercial? Let us know.
Brilliant one.
I'm sure it's brilliant.
Will be, but it's for money. No, I've been approached by a highly reputable organisation who've asked me if I would do some telecommercials and a few radio commercials and a few other things for a year for them, and I've agreed. But that's another story. Thank you, sir, and maybe you'll see me one day when the commercial appears, if I make it by Monday. Good night.
2GB, Macquarie National News.
The 9 o'clock news, good morning, I'm Rob Gooder. Veteran talkback broadcaster John Pearce is dead, aged in his early 70s.
He died yesterday, aged 71.
Some called him the Prince of Provocation. Others called him Mr. Fierce. But everyone called him entertaining. He knew how to stir his listeners. People either loathed or loved him, but they always listened.
My grandmother used to complain week in, week out.
Broadcaster John Harker.
That nasty man on Saturday and Sunday nights, I can't stand that John Pearce. He's so rude, I'm never listening to him again. She must have said that nearly every week, but of course every week she was tuned in to 2GB.
What is the proper way to sit at a computer?
On a chair.
Using the computer?
On a chair.
You claim to know so much about a computer.
Well, I just answered you.
Now, you tell me which is the proper way to sit at a computer all day.
On a chair.
If you are working in an office.
On a chair.
Sit down, up, or in the middle.
You wonderful person. There's no such thing as sitting down, up, or in the middle.
Mr. Pearce, I have spoken to experts about computers.
But forget computers for a moment. Please take... No, just a sec, please. Please. Oh, no, look, you can help us more than we know. Would you please describe to us what is sitting up, down, or in the middle?
Well, the experts.
Now, you tell me what sitting up, down, or in the middle means.
Apparently you haven't spoken to the expert.
I am an expert.
John had a split personality. One was his radio persona. The other, well, it was warm, kind, caring. Those close to him knew him as God-fearing, a tireless worker for charity, and a recipient of the Order of the British Empire in 1971. Broadcaster John Laws.
I first met John Pearce when John Pearce was working with Andrea at 2GB, and they did a morning program together which was sensational. He, with his fast mind and his what would have been called today chauvinistic approach to life, they were a wonderful couple. And John Pearce went on to do wonderful things in broadcasting. Fine broadcaster and a good friend, and on occasions a good ally. He and I did programs together on 2GB over a very long period of time. So John Pearce has been known to me for a long, long time, for many, many years. John Pearce did a lot for radio. He spent many years in it and made a huge contribution. And I and many other Australians will think, when we think of John Pearce, of good things, of good radio, and of a good man.
Former manager of 2GB, Des Foster.
He was an absolutely, totally rounded character. He had a rather wicked sense of humour and a sense of mischief, and he was very, very quick-witted, and he had an inquiring mind. He really covered the whole range of emotions, and a most interesting and fascinating man. We really are suffering a lot.
Dan Zamanek.
I must say that in the last few years, I've always listened to John on the weekends. I know him from a rival station, but you know, if you want to hear some of the best talent, they're obviously spread around different stations. And I used to listen to Pearcey on a Saturday night as I was going out to one of my cabaret shows, and he was fantastic. He was always on the ball, always had his own opinions, whether you agree with him or not. It was always riveting radio. He was the leader in his industry, and it was a tough industry, and to be able to stay around for so long and at the top of the tree in this sort of cutthroat industry just speaks highly of the man, and just shows you what a great mark he has left in this talkback and radio industry. We'll certainly miss John Pearce, and I don't think he can ever be replaced.
2GB program manager Les Thompson.
I have some tremendous memories of John, especially as a kid in this industry. One of the first books I picked up was How to Win Friends and Interview People, and that was by John, and it just gave me such good clues as to how to go about what is a craft, and that is doing a skillful interview. And he was just a great broadcaster, and he wanted to bring information and entertainment to the radio audiences, and he certainly did that. The other thing is, of course, a couple of decades after that, I came into 2GB as program director, and one of the first things John Pearce said to me was, look after my radio station. Because in many ways John Pearce was 2GB and 2GB was John Pearce.
2UE's Brian Bury.
He worked with the greats, but he was great. He brought out that special thing in lots of people. He made them think, and I think he liked that, didn't he say? He wanted that on his tombstone, at least I made them think. And even though he stirred people, he stirred it in a way that got them thinking and asking questions, and that's what it's all about. John Pearce really was an icon of broadcasting. We'll not see his like again, I don't think, because he was special and he was very unique.
Broadcaster John Harker.
John could be rude, in fact he could be downright nasty, as we all know, but off the air, he didn't have a nasty bone in his body. A lot of people have already spoken about, you know, the loss of a true radio legend, which he was, one of the pioneers of talk, of course, but all of that goes without saying. You can't help thinking that a part of radio history is gone with John, but for me, I'm just going to remember him as a great bloke. A bloke who had the time to give a young fellow some advice and encouragement when I started out, and I wouldn't mind betting that he's right up there now, debating with all the crowd and probably still getting the last word.